We're just going to begin. The ones who are meant to be here are here. So you've all already met or heard Reverend Dr. Lisa Presley from the Mid-America region of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations.
Try putting that on a business card.
Yeah. And she's just here to answer your questions. So Rob and I will have mics and we'll pass them around. Raise your hands when you have something to ask and we'll see what we learn.
I don't know how many of you are people who listened to Car Talk on NPR. I always feel like these things are stump the chump opportunities, you know, so I can be like Tom and Ray and be that cool. But really, who has a question? Raise your hand and a mic will appear. All right, I see a couple people, yay. You know, and if you don't have questions, that's fine. I will not be offended, so, but I do want to be helpful.
I was just wondering, you said during your message that there were like 40 churches a year that were looking for ministers. Are there 40 ministers to fill those jobs?
Oh, that's such a great question. In ordinary times, there have been between 40 and 60, maybe up to 80 congregations looking, and between 60 and 80 or so ministers looking. And you would think the numbers would work out, except some of those ministers are only looking for one particular congregation, or they might be geographically restricted, or that kind of thing. So it doesn't work out that well. And this just immediate past year, we had a phenomenon that I have not seen in my time at the as a UU minister. It has been forecast for years that with all the baby boom ministers retiring, we were going to end up with the shortage of ministers, et cetera. They've been saying that for the last 10 to 15 years. This year, both from retirements of ministers, from ministers who were so exhausted from the pandemic, because most ministers and other staff didn't get any time off in 20 because the pandemic happened in March of 20. They didn't get time off because there was that maybe wishful thinking it would be over and we'd be back in, for that first September. No. So they were trying to figure out that, and plus they had been trying to figure out congregations been figuring out how do we do this online and all this kind of stuff. Then in the summer of 21, everyone thought, okay, now we get to gear up for coming back in person, and then Delta hit. So they didn't get much time off in 21 because they were trying to figure out how do we do this multi-platform stuff. And so they didn't get much time off in 21. And then in the summer of 22 was probably the first time that many ministers really got any time off. And some of them just realized how exhausted they were and how burnt out. And so there were more ministers who left ministry during this time of the great resignation. I think of it as a great reorientation. Is this feeding me anymore? So people left then. And then, because now I know you've never experienced this in your congregation, but you have great imaginations. When there have been conflicts in congregations, sometimes ministers say, I don't want to do this. And many of the the newer ministers, not necessarily aged younger, but newer ministers, had experienced or witnessed conflict in congregations, and they're called to ministry, but they want to do community ministry or something other than in a congregation because they've seen how hard that can be. And so this past year, for the first time, we ended up with something like 40 or 50 congregations nationwide who did not get the ministry they were looking for. There was no one available. In our region, we had, depending on how you count and who was able to get some, we had between 8 and 10 congregations that did not get the ministry they were looking for. The congregations that did not were mostly congregations that were looking for part-time ministry, congregations that were geographically isolated, and congregations that were more the pastoral size congregations, so 1 to 200 members, more or less. I happen to, in our region during the pandemic, because there wasn't enough going on, we decided to change how we related to congregations. We used to relate to congregations based on geography, who lived closest to them, and they became our primary congregations. Our regional lead had the brainstorm of, wouldn't it be smarter for us to do it by congregation size? Because when I had Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio, I had congregations that ranged from 10 members to 700 members. And as you can imagine, what they need is a little bit different. So I now work primarily with the pastoral size, which are the 100 to 200. Susan Dittmar, who is your primary contact, works with congregations roughly 200 to 350, 400. And David Pyle, our regional lead, works with the large congregations. And Phil Lund, our other colleague, works with all the small congregations, and there's some variation, in that. But I had 8 of the 45 congregations I'm directly working with usually. I had 8 or 10 of them who have not gotten the ministry they wanted. It's only been in that group. So a congregation that's your size is much more likely to be able, and we don't know if that was a one-year blip or if it's a pattern or what. We simply don't know, but it's the first time when when congregations couldn't get what they want, couldn't be assured that they could get what they wanted. Long answer, but it's a great question. We don't know, so we'll know, next summer, we'll know whether or not it looks like a trend or if it's just, wow, this is a crazy year. Other questions? Oh, come on. One more?
How long, on average, and I know it's a tough question, but how long does it usually take, first of all, a search committee to get up to speed to be able to really do their job? And then secondly, on average, how long or how many coming in and are trying to become the minister, or at least becoming interested in our church? How long does that on average take?
So there, as I mentioned in the sermon, there is a very particular timeline that is there. And what we recommend is that a search committee be elected in like the April-May timeframe. Because they have until the middle of November to prepare all the materials that they need in order to be able to go online. Our search system program is now exclusively online. It might have been a bit when you called Suzelle, but that would have been in the really early days of that. And so the congregations have to send their stuff to the primary contact in mid-November so we can review it. Not to say yes or no, but to reflect back, this is how I interpret what you wrote. Is that what you mean? And because sometimes, people don't know how it, you think it looks great, but you don't necessarily know how others will read it. And then the search committee says, oh yeah, that's what we meant, great. Or they'll say, oh, we're gonna make some tweaks. Their material is best to have in by the end of November. And then ministers who are in search go online and look at all the congregational records that are there. And they look at, is this a place that intrigues me or not? And they get the option to click yes or no, I want my name to be sent to that congregation. Then either on January 1st or January 2nd, I can't remember which day, congregations are then, the portal is opened up and congregational search committees get to see the names and the ministerial records of all the ministers who are interested in them. It could be as few as 0 or 1, or it could be 15 or 20, depending on, if it's paying $1 million and is on one of the coasts with a great house of a view of an ocean, it's going to get the 1,000. If it is paying below scale, or part-time or in a really isolated part of the country where there are no colleagues and you have to get there by wagon train, they're going to get very few. So they look, so those names get released in January. The search committee then has the first few weeks in January to look at their material and decide who they want to do a virtual interview with. And we encourage them to do it with as many people as they can, because sometimes people don't come across as well on paper as they do in, you know, when you're actually having a conversation. Sometimes they come off better in paper, so, you know, so they have those conversations with the various ministers. And what their goal is during that January time is to figure out who are 3 to 5, usually it's 3, ministers we want to invite here that we're really seriously interested in, so that the search committee can then have what's called a pre-candidating weekend. So they really need to make that decision in January. And then in February and March, the search committees have these pre-candidates who come in. They have lots of meals together, they have a long interview, they tour the building, so the minister can show the area, and try to, you know, go out to meals at places where nobody else from the congregation will see them. So, you know, and so they do that, and then the minister preaches in what's called a neutral pulpit, not the congregation where they may be serving, and not here. One of the things we've learned over time is that if the congregation gets to see all the pre-candidates, it divides the congregation. You know, nobody's going to, I often tell, it's like when the city of Thunder Bay, which Julie knows, when they used to be Port Arthur and Fort William. They were 2 cities and they combined, or did I get those 2? I always get them mixed up. One of them was Port, the other was Fort, one was William, one was Arthur. But they decided to combine, and they decided to have a name the town, name the city, plebiscite, or, you know, whatever. There were 3 names on the ballot. One was, I can't remember the third, but one was Lakehead. The other, one was Thunder Bay. One was Lakehead, and the third was the Lakehead. Thunder Bay got the most votes, but Lakehead and the Lakehead combined got more votes than Thunder Bay did. So, you know, that's just another example of how you want to be really careful when you're asking people and what you're asking them. So, so that's why the search committee then does this. They're also doing reference checks to find out how the minister has been where they've been before. And then after they've done the pre-candidating, they need to then decide, okay, of these 3, is there anyone we want to recommend? Or if so, who would we want to recommend in order? They send that list to the director of transitions, and the minister prepares a similar list of the places I've been. You know, and there's more detailed steps to this, but places I've been and where do I want to go? It's not so that the director of transitions can manipulate the search in any way, but what happens is on a particular Thursday, at the end of March or beginning of April, at noon Eastern time, search committees can call up a minister and say, we want you to be our minister. Will you take that? So what was happening is ministers would panic, you know, okay, what happens if my second choice calls me before my first choice? What do I say? How do I figure this out? What happens, you know, and if a search committee called and the phone was busy, they would panic because, oh my God, somebody else is grabbing our minister. So what Keith, who's the director, does is he looks at the list and sees where they match up and where they don't. So he says to a congregation or a search committee, you're going to be really happy because your first choice, you're also their first choice. And if it's not, what it does, Keith will say, you might want to think about what other options you have, because there's nothing worse than finding out at noon or noon 01 that your first choice doesn't want you, and then trying to figure out, okay, do we offer it to the second, don't we offer it, you know? And it gives the search committee a bit of time to figure out what's next. Do we want to go into the second round of search? Or, you know, how do we do that? So So that's sort of the timeline of the whole thing. Oh, then once the minister says yes, they want to be the candidate, there's a couple other little steps that happen. But then they come and they are here with you for 8 to 10 days. They preach one Sunday. They attend more committee meetings and potlucks than is humanly possible in that time between. They preach a second Sunday. They go away from the building. You have a congregational meeting. You discuss the minister and vote. You advise the minister of that vote. Sometimes ministers might want to take a bit of time to reply to the vote, especially if it's not, if the percentage isn't exactly what they were hoping for. It doesn't mean they won't come, but they need to think about it. Sometimes they will say yes immediately if the vote is affirmative and come back and you all party and dance. So that's the timeline of what it is. And the reason why we have you start it not, we didn't, if we'd had you start it, in that March, April time this year, you wouldn't have known what you wanted, because you were still in the midst of the departures and the stuff, as I call it. So you need to be able to have that time for the interim process and the interim minister and the transition team to be able to help you deal with the past and look toward the future so they, again, know where you want to go rather than reflecting only on where you've been. Don't you love these short answers I'm giving you to all these questions?
Can I add something before you move on?
Absolutely.
Is that okay? I don't think I've told anyone this. It's not a secret, but I don't think I've told any of you this, that I first met Suzelle when I was interning in Wausau, and she was just beginning here. And she actually sent me, I was then getting ready to go into candidating for ministry, and she sent me what was her ministerial packet, which was, if any of you were on the search committee for Suzelle, was like a 3-inch, 3-ring binder full of stuff. She sent it to me, FedEx to Thunder Bay, I think. Yeah, to Thunder Bay. And that was my example for how I would put together my packet when I went into search. And I often think of the pictures in it. She wore hats then too. So, do I have to be this kind of minister? And now, that just kind of leads into saying that Lisa was saying what they look like on paper many times, but the search packet now, and some of you were on the interim search team, is ministers have websites, not packets. And so everything about us is on a website that you're looking at, but still the minister is presenting themselves in a certain way. However, whatever that is, photos, articles, pictures, sermons, videos, writings, essays, stuff about their past. And I think what I wanted to reflect back to you is that for me, looking at a packet, and I know you're not the search committee putting that together, but it speaks to this time in the interim of how to get really honest about who you are and what you want, because it comes across in packets how much either people cut and pasted and plugged in something, whether a congregation can name its aspirations honestly and where they have shortfalls, all that kind of stuff. You're not necessarily, it's not good to try to sell yourself as something you aren't, because it's not that a congregation isn't perfect that will mean you won't get a minister, because none of them are. So you want to know so where do we match? Where do we understand each other? Where do we have common experiences and understandings? Where are the things that would challenge the minister and want to come in to work with a congregation and all of that? So it's not just, let's write a pretty statement of who we want to be. It's also, how are we going to get there, and where do we see our roadblocks are going to be? How would a minister help us with that?
Thank you. That's a really important thing, because, ministers do not expect you to be perfect. Well, maybe some who are brand new and still are wet behind the ears, but we want to know whether or not our gifts can help you go where you want to go. The interim ministries I did, most of them were really thorny. I was in one, I was their 7th minister in 5 years. No, their 5th minister in 7 years, sorry. I was their 5th minister in 7 years. It's a little bit better, but it's still pretty wonky. And I loved going in and because they were honest and said, we've had a horrible time. We're not sure what we've done, but we know we've done something. And this kind of thing. And ministers, we do our research and we know what's going on. And a story I told either the board or the board and the transition team, I think it was yesterday, could have been 3 weeks ago. I've been here for a while. But the congregation that I served first as a called minister was a congregation that I had learned through my networking, their first minister had had sexual relationships outside of his marriage with members of the congregation. And so during the interview process, I said to the search committee, what's the lasting impact of this? Half of the search committee said, what the heck are you talking about? And the other half said, oh, it was really nothing. And then the second pre-candidate they had asked the same question. And they're going, wait a minute. So they called up the then director of transitions and said, what's going on here? How do they know this? And, some of us didn't. And the director said, well, they've obviously done their homework. That's great. But what's fascinating and what you should celebrate is they still want to be your minister. It's not that you don't have to have that perfectness. But ministers need to know what we're walking into or want to know what we're walking into. And the congregation should equally be doing their research. The search committee, not the congregation. The search committee should be doing their research on the ministers and reaching out to the references that the minister provides, developing references that you then check with the minister to make sure, so they, before you talk to them, just so they have the chance to either say, sure, that person is great, but let me let them know that you're going to call, or could say, now I know this has never happened in your congregation, but some people in congregations hate their ministers. And so it could be that the person that's calling is somebody who hates the minister and is going to go after them or is going to tell everybody in the congregation that the minister's searching. And so what you then ask the minister, if they say, please don't talk to that the person, you say, well, who might be a responsible critic who can speak, even though you might not get along, can speak honestly about who you are in ministry and be able to give us a perspective without endangering your position in that congregation in case we don't choose you. And I've forgotten the question, but I hope that helps. Okay, we have one here, and then back there, Rob, in a moment. So,
I'm not real sure how to say this, but I want to know what do I need to ask myself? What are the questions I should be thinking about to get me to the point to realize where have I been? Where do I want to go? I'm getting to the age where I'm happy just being here with all of you. Things can kind of float off me, but seriously, I do want to honestly be involved.
So part of it is, this is the job of the interim minister and the transition team to provide opportunities for congregation members to talk to each other in small groups and stuff, to be able to look at where have you been, who are you now, who do you want to be? And so they're going to be devising processes to help you have those conversations. One of the things that we really suggest does not happen is that everybody fills out a survey in their own home where they're not hearing other people's voices. Because one of the things that you might experience is that if you only talk to people who think like you, you're going to think that the world is the way that you think. And by having cross-pollination to find out that the hymn that's your favorite, somebody else thinks suck, and vice versa, it's good to know, because then you'll understand that one of the pressures in congregational life is, how do we balance out the competing desires, needs, interests in a congregation? And so by having the conversations together, that helps you understand that and figure out where you want to go. Plus, also, just like that search committee, where half of them knew a story and the other half did not, you each hold stories about this congregation that will help others understand how you got to be here. Who are you now? And it helps you also make choices about who do we want to be with each other. I'm working with a congregation now, sorry, board and transition team, you're hearing a lot of the same stories we talked about yesterday, where the board had a number of years ago expelled a couple of members who were bullies and were browbeating everybody and were withholding money and were trying to foment to get what they wanted in the congregation. And a member of the worship committee got curious about how have we had fights in the past. And they looked, the congregation was founded in 1836. And in the 1800s, every 20 years, they had a fight. And that fight always involved bullying, browbeating, and financial money withholding. Sometimes people left, sometimes they came back. But it was like clockwork every 20 years. So they're in their DNA, in their culture, they had this pattern of how do we fight? And it was messy. And now they're working on how can we fight better? Not that there won't be fights, but how do we do it in a way where we can come back together without as many casualties? And so part of it, but they wouldn't know that unless they're talking together. And so it's really figuring that out together.
I missed the first part of your answer to the very first question, but my question has to do with how many candidates there are, but nevertheless, what kind of diversity, both sexual diversity, age diversity, race, skin color diversity, and then I've read some things recently about some Unitarian churches being, what would I use, more Christian in their approach to theology. And so where does all this fit? I mean, there's multiple questions there, but
Perfect.
How do you organize it?
So let me start with the theology. Most UU ministers know that we live in a multi-theologically based system. That in every congregation there may be people who define themselves as Christian or Buddhist or agnostic or atheist or humanist or whatever. The Junitarian is another one. And so ministers have learned how to be fluid in how they talk in their language. And so if someone can only speak in Christian language, chances are they won't be chosen by congregations that don't have that as a strong strain. We do have many congregations on the East Coast that really celebrate their Christian foundation, and that is part of their stuff. You know, it's sort of like if you drew, on the East Coast, wait, that was east. On the East Coast, the Christianity is up here, and it goes like this as you go to the West Coast. And on the West Coast, you might have humanism, and spirit-based is really high, and it comes down this way, you know? And that's just part of the culture of the regions. It is really hard to quantify how many ministers and how many of what type of minister, because every year the search pool is different. It's, depending on whose kids have finally graduated from high school, so they have the flexibility to move. Who wants a different challenge, has taken the congregation as far as they can. Every year there are candidates who will define themselves as LGBTQ and trans. The T is in there, but so there will be that. We have an increasing number of ministers who are African American or people of color, but we're much better on LGBTQ things. When I was studying for the ministry, I could count on two hands with fingers left over the number of lesbian and gay, it was only lesbian and gay back then, ministers we had in the association. There were exactly the same number of African American ministers. When you look now, at least 10, if not more, like 20% of our ministers are probably LGBTQ, and we still have very few black ministers. And so, you know, it makes me wonder, what is it in our culture, other than, oh, perhaps racism, that has made it difficult for black ministers to be in our, and just the prevailing white supremacy culture ideas that we've all been impacted by. So we don't know any year as part of the answer. There is some of everything in the mix. There are probably not as many people of color as there are LGBTQ individuals in ministry. Julie, would you agree with that assessment of who our colleagues are?
Yes, I would, and I think one thing to think about is if the question of diversity is, I'll just say it more clearly, if the congregation said, we would really like to have a person who identifies in some marginalized way, that we feel like that would help us in some way, you know, if that a direction the congregation decided to go. There's also the question of, is this the place for them? Like, how comfortable would it be for them to be here,
Yep.
to live here? So that's all very real. And yeah, then the other thing I would say about ministers of color, religious professionals of color, is there has been, how long has I always want to say coming home, that's not quite right.
Finding Our Way Home?
Finding Our Way Home gathering for religious professionals of color, 5 years?
I don't know, probably 8 to 10.
Oh, you think it's longer than that?
It might be. It's a annual gathering for any religious professional, not just ministers, who is a person of color, to come together to be a cohort and support each other. Yeah.
And my understanding is that that has been a really powerful, supportive way for
Right.
the association and our congregations to support
Yeah.
people of color in ministry in our congregations, that's been really soul nourishing for them to have that connection and support.
Right, and I'm working with another congregation that thought that they had done the work around anti-racism and wanted to advertise that we are looking for a minister of color. They did end up calling a minister of color and discovered how much latent and unexpected racism they had in their congregation. And they were shocked and surprised and didn't know how to deal with it, and the ministry ended up ending because the congregation wasn't fully ready for what they thought they were. Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions for us, not just the board, but as a congregation as a whole, how we can compel participation and get people back, because they're upset with the tumultuousness, plus that's coming on the heels of the tumult of COVID. And so I look around and we're missing a lot of people that were here for a long time. And I know that it's a number of combined factors, but it seems to me that we'd all be better served if they were in the room.
This is one of the things from the pandemic that we're not going to know the answer to for a long time, about how do we define ourselves as a community. Because for some people, although in my being here with you, you know, Friday, Saturday, today, I have seen very few people wearing masks, which means to me, not that that's a good thing or a bad thing, that people feel comfortable. The people who are here are ones who feel comfortable risking being in groups, in person. There may be many of those people who aren't back here, who are participating online and are choosing for a variety of reasons, either for their own health issues and concerns, for their mobility, for the ease of their life. And so one of the challenges that congregations are going to have is, how do we be a congregation that is both in person and online? And so how do we change our understanding, and how do we operate in a way that allows people who are online to be part of who we are? The answers to that is going to vary. So it is a redefinition for every congregation about who do we mean when we say us or we. Is it only the people who can show up in person? How do we include people who are online? How do we make that so that there's no stigma about which you've chosen? And that's something we're all trying to figure out, and none of us have the answer to. As far as how do you invite back people who have left because of disappointment and hurt and all of that kind of stuff, basically you do the work. You figure out how to deal with and recognize what were the hurts. And you find ways to reach out across divides that might be there and do that. And you can let people know, hey, this is the work we're doing. And some of them may come back because they witness how you are changing as a community into something that resembles more what they are hoping for. And you can't make anyone ever come back. So you also have to pay attention to who is it that you want to be those who are still here. And who else might there be out there who will join us now? Congregations that have conflict are forever changed. And there's a great longing to bring people back, and it often does not work because of the depth of the pain. And also some people don't come back because we know that anytime a minister leaves, we anticipate a 10% drop or change of membership. 10% of the people won't be there. Part of it is because the sense of loyalty to that minister no longer is keeping them here. You know, so especially with people whose lives have changed, like, you know, maybe they were coming for the kids, and then they were coming because they were there. When the minister leaves, it's their chance to be able to sort of leave guilt-free, because nobody's going to notice, you know. And most congregations do lose members every year because of stuff. But one of the issues with the pandemic is most congregations did not replace those members during the pandemic. Some congregations have actually grown during the pandemic, which is absolutely fascinating. They've increased by 10 to 20%. I haven't done a study to find out why, but I think part of it is they figured out how to work well with the in-person and online, and how were they supporting people online, and how did that community, how did they create that? And it might be something about who they were even before the pandemic. So it's always a lovely desire, and I always think it's great to say to people, I've missed you, I would like to see you again. Also, if there were people who were hurt by what happened here, if you can send a heartfelt, real apology, saying I'm sorry for my part in what might be why you left, never hurts. It might not bring them back, but at least they know that somewhere someone is thinking about them, and that their pain has been recognized. Julie.
I just wanted to add before we went on that in case there's someone out there online, we don't know, we can't tell if anyone's watching, and your comments reminded me that there might be someone right now watching, that if they want to send a question, the easiest way, because we don't have interactive live stream, would be to email Vicki, who could pick it up. So vickib@uucw.org. And if you want to email a question, Vicki will transmit it.
Yay! Thank you. All right.
I have two questions, if that's okay, but I'll ask the first one first. It has to do with diversity, the flip side of what Pat was asking about. Selecting the search committee is obviously a critical thing, and I heard you over the weekend say something very important about selecting that committee and whether you need a diverse group on the committee or people that you trust that understand diversity. And I was wondering if you could speak to that so the congregation has a better idea of that.
Sure. Often congregations, when they're trying to put together a search committee, will say, well, we need one person from RE, we need one person from music, we need one person from this, we need to be able to represent those voices on the committee. And what you actually need are people who are on the committee who can represent the congregation as a whole, and figure out and have deep conversations and find out ways to invite feedback and input from all segments of the congregation. And And so right now online at uua.org/transitions, anyone who wants can go and look at the settlement handbook for information about what actually goes on in a search. But one of the things in there is a section on, or a description of how to choose a search committee and the members for that. What is recommended, and people often say, but we're too big to do that. This process was designed in large congregations. So just bear that in mind. That when it's time to do this, the board, maybe sometimes aided by the nominating committee, calls on the telephone every member of the congregation. If the person doesn't answer, they just say, hey, this is Lisa calling to get your input on the search committee. If you'd like to have that conversation, call me back. So you don't have to, go stalk them and sit outside their house until they show up. But there's a series of recommended questions, and I can't remember what those are, but one of them is, who would you trust to be on the search committee? And what they do is they write down the names. So if you rhyme off 5 names, they'll write those 5 names. If somebody else says 6 names and 5 of them are the same, they write down all those names. And they keep track of how many times have certain people in the congregation been named. And then, because what you need is a group that is trusted and isn't seen to be a group that has a particular, I have to make sure that the person who comes is not a Packers fan. If they come onto the search committee with that attitude, they're not going to be able to be open to what the rest of the congregation might need. And so you start with the list of the people who the congregation names as the ones they trust. Some of those people won't be interested. Others will be. But also within that listing, the board or the nominating committee, I can't remember what your bylaws say, who puts the slate together, looks to try to see, is there diversity here of long-term tenure, shorter tenure, that kind of stuff, and tries to do it, but it starts with who does the congregation trust. Because without that trust, the search, and it also removes it then from a popularity contest, where the person who has the best buttons or the best goodies that they bribe you with on Sunday morning, can get. So it looks like there's a question from online. Oh, Phil, your second question.
Hopefully this is brief. I'm jumping to the end of the process now.
Yes.
So the congregation is voting on a new minister, and I don't remember what the value is here. Let's say you need 80% approval, and they get 82%. From what you said earlier, some ministers might not come because they won't come unless they have 90% or 95% approval? Is that what happens?
It differs with every minister. First of all, your bylaws will state, here's the plurality we need, both for the quorum and for what percentage of affirmative votes before you can offer. So that's always that. But ministers often want at least 90 to 95%. Ministry is one of the few jobs where it's about relationship first and competency second. If you are going into a position where at least one out of every 10 people doesn't think you're the right person, it can be a really hard slog. And so often ministers want that higher thing. But I remember back in the late 80s, one of my colleagues, Mark DeWolf, who was a gay man, and very few open gay men had been called to pulpits. He got a 70% vote at a congregation. And he, having listened and heard about this, he thought, they're all worried that having a gay minister is going to be the problem. And so he said yes to a 70% vote. And he had a marvelous ministry there. And when several years later, he had been there about 7 or 8 years, I think he was diagnosed with AIDS. That congregation could not have been better. Sorry. He was a dear friend. And so part of it is, why is the vote low? Is it something the minister thinks that they can get around or work and help people realize there's a difference? So if there's something that's really apparent that they think that's not going to bother me and I can make this work, they might say yes. But they might not, because again, the job is all about relationship. And if people don't think you're the person they can relate to, then that just makes it really, really tough. Okay, now we're going to have the online question. Woohoo!
Yes, I'm just going to read directly. This question comes from Steph Richardson. Says, please share how congregations can choose a minister before all the outlined steps take place. I'm referring to the fact that some of us wanted Rev D to stay, others didn't, but those who wanted her to stay feel like we weren't even given a chance to look at that option. And then there's a second email that follows up.
Okay.
That says, I'll just finish.
Oh.
Rev D fit a lot of the diversity areas we are supposedly wanting. And then a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush.
So here's a fun thing in our system. Congregations can call and hire whomever they want. Ministers who are in fellowship, which means they have had the stamp of approval of being a UU minister, must follow the search process. And so congregations say, oh great, all we have to do is find somebody who doesn't want to follow the process. Well, then you're also hiring somebody or calling somebody who isn't accountable to the system and structure that they're belonging in, and whose ethics are a little off. So there are rules that exist for ministers that prevent them from doing things. So in the case of Reverend Denise, in any congregation where there is someone who is interested in being considered as a minister who already is what we call an inside candidate, they have a relationship with the congregation. In order to keep the playing field of hiring level, that person has to be considered first before any other candidates are there, and then and decided yes or no. And I'm getting to the answer, but I have to lay out all these different rules, because there's also the 3-year rule. These rules have numbers. I don't ever remember the numbers. The 3-year rule is that if you have served in a congregation in any capacity, you must have a 3-year period before you can apply for a position there. So if the person is thinking, we want, and also if you're an interim minister, you cannot stay. You may not stay. So, so as I understand it, the decision was made that there was concern that Reverend Denise might not have had sufficient training in ministry to be able to do the interim work well. Interim work is a specialization, sort of like, a cardiologist. They were a general practitioner first, and then they get the extra training. So ministers who are interim need that extra training in order to do it. It's an additive skill, and it's different than if a minister is your called minister. So what could happen, the decision was made that Reverend Denise, that from what I understand, that people wanted a minister with more ministerial experience to be able to do the interim work because of its specialized form. Reverend Denise could, if your search process takes a while, and could apply if it would be 3 years after her departure by the time she was, you were looking for a minister. So if you were looking for a minister for 2025 as opposed to 2024, she could apply. And so it's not definitely closed loop where Reverend Denise could not. But so I don't know whether you were hoping that Reverend Denise could be the interim or Reverend Denise could be the called minister. One is still possible, the other was not. And so that Reverend Denise had to, by the UUA rules, because she's a minister in fellowship, had to say, be considered first and not along with the other pool of interim ministers. Can't remember the rest of the question. Did I get most of the answers there?
I think you're answering what was posted. I think it, yes.
And
Some of it can't be answered, right? I mean,
right,
so
and yeah, and why was Reverend Denise not chosen? I don't know. There will be some people who, are clearly upset about that choice. And the question is, what do you then do with that? What does any member do when they're upset about something the congregation has chosen to do or chosen not to do? I remember I used to serve on the UUA's Commission on Appraisal, which is a study think tank for the UUA. And we were doing a report on membership. And I remember one of the other people on the committee, Earl Holt, talked about when do people join a church or a congregation. And Earl taught me something that I think is true, which is when you join a congregation, and I think this works also for any other deep relationship, personal, is not when you first come in and say, ooh, this feels like home. And it's not when you sign the guest book or the membership book and become a member. When you really join is when you face your first major disappointment and choose to stay. Because congregations, like all human beings and all institutions, are fallible. And so the question is, was the disappointment large enough that you say, this is no longer the place for me, and you then leave? Or is it when you say, I still believe in this place, even though a decision went in a way that I think was wrong? And that's an individual choice.
Just a bit of follow-up. So Steph wrote back to say, I understand. So we need to develop a process that allows for that to include exemptions in a fairly easy way, because diversity is so needed, at least we say, and then transparency was not there. And I think what she's saying, and Stephanie sent another email if I'm not getting this, is that in some ways the process is more difficult for people of color and who have marginalized identities, no matter where it is or what it is. So how do we compensate?
Actually, the process would have been the same if I was the person. The process is the process. The Ministerial Fellowship Committee is looking at their processes because they're the body that makes these decisions and these rules. They're looking at their processes, and they do have diversity on that committee, and they are looking at, are there things in our rules that need to be changed? But it's not the congregation's process necessarily, it's the UUA's process. And it's the Ministerial Fellowship Committee that determines these rules in order to make sure that there is a level playing field as much as possible. They impact all ministers who have a prior relationship with the congregation, regardless of their diversity status. I see you have the microphone, so I think you have a question.
Well, you've already answered the ministerial fellowship quotient, and we're talking about congregational side, but the other side of that, as far as the supply quantity, is, thank you, you've been well defined. There's rules, there's procedures in place, and they are given advice or counsel as they approach. Mm-hmm. Is that right? Is this a place to ask that?
I'm not quite understanding what the question is.
What about the ministers who are in search? Do they get attention in terms of approaching congregations that are in search?
The way that ministers approach congregations that are in search is they click yes or no on whether or not they want their name to come to the congregation. If they click yes and the search committee decides not to interview them, oh well. Just like any other job, if you apply, there's nothing that guarantees you an interview. And so that could do it. Also, what can happen is if there is a minister that members think, ooh, this is the person, you know, because I've been scoping out online and I've been seeing every minister in the universe and listening to all their sermons, I really want Susie Smith to be our minister, then a member of the congregation can say to the search committee, please consider Susie Smith. And then the search committee has the ability, they do not have to, but they have the ability to reach out to Susie Smith and say, we would love you to consider coming to our congregation. Please check us out online in the settlement system. And then Susie Smith goes into the settlement system and then can say yes or no. Or Susie Smith could say, what? Are you crazy? Why would I leave my $1 million home in Malibu to come to a frozen tundra like Minneapolis or Milwaukee? That's where I am. I knew I was in one of those M cities. So that can happen. But there's no way for a minister to, there's no ethical way for a minister to sidle up to a search committee and say, pick me, pick me, pick me, pick me. Other than saying, send my name to them. They could in their ministerial record saying, the only place in the world I ever want to be a minister is UU Church West, and that could convey something. But if they're also clicking on other congregations, and other congregations read, the only place I want to serve is UU Church West, you know, and you don't want them, they're sort of, you know, they've sunk their boat. Yeah, here, and then we'll go, the gentleman on the corner, on the edge here. Yes.
I've heard that some congregations do 3 years of an interim. And when we started this process, maybe because of COVID, Sharon Dittmar had told us that more congregations were choosing to take even a longer period of time. Can you help explain how people come to that decision, and when is that right, and when is it not advisable?
Thank you. So, so the concern about having a 3-year interim period is that then that becomes the minister you have to then grieve and deal with, and they become crucial to the congregation in a way. You know, if you're only there for 2 years and you keep on saying, I come pre-fired, I come pre-fired, I come pre-fired, you might have heard that line before, then it's easier with only 2 years. 3 years, it gets a little trickier to do that, to make sure you have a good transference of the affection, trust, and respect to the new minister. During the pandemic, especially in the early days, it was, you know, how do you get people talking together and do the work that of the healing the hurts and the looking at the heritage and doing, how do you do that when you're only online? And so there are some ministers who were interims for 2 years who never were in the congregational building. Those, you know, for 2 years. And so then, yeah, extending that another year. There's also some ministerial searches that happened only online. Anybody who was settled in 2021. 20 because when the pandemic hit, both 20 and 21, much of that search was online because you couldn't go visit. But it's picked up again. So part of it is those were amazingly unforeseen circumstances. There might be something else. If a major trauma were to happen in your congregation during the 2-year time, that might derail the interim work. That might be a reason for a 3rd year. 3rd years also happen sometimes if you do not find a minister during your search year, during that 2nd year. Sometimes interims stay. Sometimes interims have other ideas and other plans and are already planning on going somewhere else. So, so that's it, and it's something that is really takes into account what's happened in your congregation, what's going on, why might you need a third year. There is also another type of ministry called developmental ministry, which is for congregations who have been through the interim period, and during that interim period they realize that there are things that are really sticky issues they want to make sure they deal with before they call their next minister. And so the choice could be made to enter into a developmental ministry program where that minister comes for 3 to 7 years, usually it's 4 or 5 years, and it's left a little at the end with the congregation having stated, these are the 3 or 4 things we really need help working on. And not only has the board said that, but the congregation has said, we're all in to do that hard work. And then the developmental minister can come and help you do that, and then you would go into search after that developmental minister leaves. The developmental minister also cannot stay. And any third-year extension of an interim has to be approved by the transitions office in consultation with the regional staff and the minister. I'm so glad I still know answers to questions.
I like the process and I have some understanding with it. My concern is the total time and the communication with the total congregation. In other words, if they hear nothing, for a fair period of time from the search committee, do you advise them on how and when to communicate with them?
Oh, yeah. Early, often, and all the time, and in multiple ways. So once the search committee is impaneled, they go on a retreat, they figure out what jobs they're doing within the search. We encourage them to do things like a display that says, here's the timeline, and here's where we are. They do have a survey that they will send out that will ask questions and stuff. They are never anonymous. A survey, I say this anytime I get a chance, a survey should never, ever, ever, ever be anonymous, because we are trying to learn how to be in deep community and covenant with each other. And if you write something and I can't read it, I can never, if I don't know who said it, I can't find out what your concern is. If you write it and you're angry about something, if I don't know who said it, there's no way we can get back into right relationship with each other. So never, ever, ever, ever. And as a minister who has received anonymous feedback, I try to be a good person. I try to be fair and honest. But when somebody has said, you really are stupid and dumb, and I think that you've done horrible things, when I'm standing up in this pulpit and I'm looking out and I know one of you has said that, my sense of inadequacy as a human being is it's hard for me not to wonder which one of you jerks I don't want to deal with anymore. So that's why we don't do anonymous surveys. But they will do surveys, and then they will do focus groups with people and with different communities. And then what they will do is they will say, here's what we have heard you say about what we want. Here's what we're thinking of writing. And so they give you all this feedback. The only time when you don't hear much from them is once they get names, because they have to keep the names confidential. As I said before, if somebody's only applying to your congregation and won't leave where they are, they're happy, but they've always wanted to be here because they want to join that rogues gallery of pictures on the hallway there. They can't tell you names, but they could say, hey, we got 7 candidates, 7 ministers, and 3 of them are female identified, 2 of them are trans identified, 5 of them are, this doesn't add up to 7, I just realized, 5 are male identified or whatever. They can give you demographics, but not to the extent that you can figure out who they're talking about. And so they tell you that. And then they say, hey, we're going off, you're not going to see us because we're going to be somewhere else talking with candidates. Don't you dare track them down. Don't you dare do that. And so they will do that, and then they will say, hey, we're at this point where we're now trying to figure out who of all we've heard we want. So they can tell you where they are in the process. They just can't tell you specifics once they start getting names. And then once they've decided, they can't tell you. So let's say they've chosen a candidate, and that candidate chooses them. You won't know the Sunday, the Friday after the offer day, who that person is, because there's a couple of things that have to happen. One is the letter of agreement will need to be negotiated. Although there's a draft letter in the packet, and the search committee should be saying, hey, are there things you want to change? You still want that gets negotiated and signed subject to the congregation's approval and the minister's acceptance of the call. They need to do a background check. And they also have to allow the minister the chance to tell the people where they are leaving that they are leaving before your congregation knows. But they can say, stand up on church on Sunday after the offer day and say, hey, we have a candidate, woohoo! Stay tuned, film at 11, or I guess it's 10 here in Central Time. So they can do that, but so there is a little bit of a delay, but they can always communicate about the process.
When I hear you say that we have to hire for who we are now.
No, for who you want to be.
So if we're hiring for who we want to be, it's clear to me, if we're looking toward the future, that we need to be embracing, as a welcoming congregation, young adults and young families. And if we're not examining how we can do that better, then I don't have as much hope for the future of the congregation as I would like to have. And I would like to see us consider that and possibly amplify the voices in our congregation who are young families and young adults, so that we aspire to become who they need us to be. And I think the pandemic has affected young families and young adults in ways that many of us of the age that many of us are not experiencing. And I would like to see us personally become that for people in our community. And so I just want their voices, and they're not here to a large extent.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the meeting time, maybe they're just spread so thin these days. Find ways to amplify those voices.
And thank you. And that is something to really talk about when you're talking about who do we want to miss us when we're gone, and doing that mission setting, as things go on. Ooh, Julie has a plethora of microphones. All right.
One last question I thought of.
Oh, only one? We've spent a lot of time together over, Friday night, all day Saturday. Yeah.
As we're doing the transition work, how do we divide up the tasks such that these are issues we need to resolve before a minister comes? These are issues we need to be working on when new minister comes. And these are issues we should probably wait to start only when the new minister gets here.
Great question, and it's going to depend on what those, there's no one answer. It depends on who this congregation is and who it wants to be. And what things might take time, because change in culture often takes 4 to 5 years to happen. So that will really depend on what people say and what comes up, and that's the deep conversation that the transition team has with the interim minister and with the board and all of that to figure out what's next. There's no answer until we know what the things are. And you can always, Sharon Dittmar as your primary contact can also help you say, well, in our experience, these are the things that take longer. So you have those resources as well, but there's no way of knowing, or there's no, that's part of the not having the answers while you're asking the questions.
And nothing's ever done.
Yeah, nothing's ever done.
So it's not like we can click off the list that we are now a kind congregation, and we're never unkind, or now we are transparent congregation and we always share everything, or now, whatever the list is,
Yeah.
we're never done.
Yeah.
But we could start movie night before the minister gets here, right?
Yeah, because, the things, what you will need to identify is what are the things are most precious to your community, and make sure you communicate that to the minister even as you're becoming, in the process. Yes?
Yeah. So how does the search committee, the transition team, the board, kind of all work together so that the voices are heard, people are hearing the same message today? Because I really appreciate you being here this weekend, because you had a lot of the decision makers in the room together all at the same time, and I really applaud that happening. So thank you, board and transition team, for all your work yesterday and Friday, or whatever days that you guys were here. But I mean, how does that, so it's not working at cross purposes, and then after all that's decided, how then, it kind of goes to something Melissa had asked earlier, is then how is the congregation being able to be involved in that so that all those voices may be heard?
Yesterday, one of the topics between the board and the transition team is how do they communicate back and forth. And so they worked on a plan for now about how the transition team will be sharing their minutes with the board. They can ask questions of the board. And so they figured out a process where they can be in relationship, and maybe even getting together quarterly over another lasagna dinner with wine. So they will be doing, so they've worked out that linkage. The transition team's work with Rev. Julie is to make sure that the congregation is involved. That's their main task, is to keep the congregation involved in the interim time and in the interim tasks or developmental tasks as is appropriate. So some of them might not involve the congregation as deeply as others. Like the healing obviously involves the congregation very deeply. What is your heritage? What has been your story? The mission. Whether or not the congregation needs to be tasked with sorting out, okay, what's the best governance style for us, and figuring that out and making changes organizationally. They should be informed, they should be listened to if they have ideas, but it might not be something that the congregation needs to weigh in, depending on whether there's a radical change. So it's really, there's, and the board's job is also to keep the congregation apprised of what's going on. And those methods, I'm not sure what happens in this congregation. The search committee it's not their job to help you find the answers. Their job is to help know what answers you're finding. Or to know, so the transition team will be doing the work with Reverend Julie on the history and that kind of stuff. So the transition team or the search committee needs to know, this is what came up, this is what we know, this is what we did, but it's not their job to replicate that. Their job is to, take the pulse as the work is being done to make sure they don't lose track of where the congregation is moving. I don't know if that helps at all.
Yes, that helps a lot. It's the communication.
You gotta talk.
Transition team, you've got a big job cut out for you. I mean, it really is.
And the search committee is also going to have a huge job too. It usually is of about a 400 to 450 hour commitment. Search committees usually meet once a week for 18 months. When you get to pre-candidating, that's 3 full weekends. When you get to candidating week, that's another 8 or 9 days, and there's homework in between. So it is a very time-consuming thing, and every member of a ministerial search committee I've ever met said it's the best work I ever did in my life in the congregation. It also comes with enormous responsibility, because the search committee is the only group that knows all the possibles. Who could have been here? And when things go wrong in the ministry, the search committee is often the ones who take on that responsibility and can feel the disappointment first sometimes. It is not uncommon if there is tension in the ministry that the search committee members disappear. When I left the congregation where I was called 8 years after I'd been there for 8 years, every member of the search committee was still deeply engaged, and that was unusual. Just like presidents will often disappear after their tenure on the board if it's been through a difficult and hard time, because they feel personally that they should have done something different. I could have done something better. I didn't give it my all, and all of that kind of thing. And especially if there's been conflict and hard times, that's the times when I think members of the congregation have to show the deepest gratitude for your elected leaders and those who step in, because no board has ever been elected that I've met who said, yeah, we want to be there and have to deal with the fight or the departure of a minister. You know, that's not what they signed up for. They signed up for the good times. And the fact that they stay and do that hard work at such deep cost to them is something that congregations need to appreciate and thank those leaders for their service during that time. And also thank those leaders' families for putting up with the absence of that leader and their distraction and all that they have done, because families bear the weight of that as well.
I just want to make another comment for when Julie Brown talked, when she said about young, the people with young families. When I hear about the time commitment, I'm really concerned about whether, they can honor that time commitment because of their families. So, is there ways that we, as a congregation or the UUA has figured out how can we include some of those people, because we know they might not have the time commitment.
And is the question, do their voices need to be in the room personally, or they can be in the room through others, through making sure you're talking with that? But things that can happen. It really got a lot easier for people with deep commitments outside of church to be on these committees when the meetings switched to Zoom. But hey, provide money for childcare. Take dinners once a week to that household so that they are relieved of that. So what are the ways that you can support any of the search committee members? What does any search committee member need to be more successful? And how can you as a caring community hold them in trust and appreciate what they're doing? Call them up. Do you want me to do your laundry? Shovel your snow, whatever. I mean, there are ways that you can maybe do a mitzvah for them that allows them to do that more readily. Are we done? There are always people who can answer future questions and stuff, and I'm glad that you've recorded this so that people who couldn't be here today get to hear my monologues. I'm really trying to think about whether I can do stand-up on the road, and so this will be, we'll send out an evaluation. Just kidding. Okay.
Well, I want to again thank Reverend Dr. Lisa Presley for being here in Brookfield with us, and for sharing so much of her knowledge and expertise in this whole area so that we're better grounded as we go more deeply into this time. It's been great to be together.
It's my honor. Thank you.